Hello, students. Today, we're going to talk about a very important psychological issue. In fact, it is the basis for which we are all here. We're going to talk about sex, gender, and sexuality, among which there is tremendous distribution. It is not zeros and ones, yeses and nos, true and false. Tremendous distribution. Let's just basically talk about right now just some basic definitions. Sex, biological traits that society associates with being male or female. Biological traits that a society associates with being male or female. Gender, which often is confused with sex. Gender, cultural meanings attached to being masculine and feminine, which influence personal identities, or in other words, man, woman, transgender, intersex, genderqueer, among others, and so on and so forth. Sexuality, sexual attraction, practices, and identity, which may or may not align with sex and gender. Heterosexual, homosexual, gay or lesbian, bisexual, queer, many other words that are associated with sexuality. Sexual development, and we talked much earlier about just general lifespan development. Sexual development is So whether you're physically or biologically male or female, that is basically the definition of sex. And I'm not talking about the act of sex now. I'm talking about the identification of sex. Gender, all psychological and social characteristics associated with being male or female, defined by one's gender identity and learned gender roles. And transsexual, a person with a deep conflict, we'll talk about this later, between his or her biological sex and preferred psychological and social gender roles. None of this is to be minimized or poo-pooed. What are some of the dimensions of sex? Genetic sex, that is double X or XY chromosomes. And in fact, chromosomally, one is, well, it's not even an absolute, is either male or female, or in other words, there's either an XX or an XY. You're either male or female. Chromosomally only, doesn't necessarily determine everything. Hormonal sex is the predominance of androgens or estrogens, which is also highly variable. Gonadal sex is whether or not one is ovaries or testes. That also can be variable. That is, during development, there can be both ovaries and or testes developed. Genital sex is clitoris and vagina in females, penis and scrotum in males. So that's just essentially, this is genital sex. Gonadal sex, ovaries or testes. Genital sex, clitoris and vagina in females, penis and scrotum in males. So we usually say, okay, well, if there's ovaries there must also be a clitoris and vagina. And if there's testes there, then there must be penis and scrotum. Generally, that's true, but you have to remember, and folks, I'm a statistician, there's great distribution in everything. Gender identity, one's subjective sense of being male or female. So let's talk about genetic sex first. The X chromosome is to initiate. This is to initiate female development. And that's two X's to initiate female development. Two X's. The Y chromosome, one along with the X, produces a male. So there's XY. So XY male, XX female. Klinefelter syndrome is we have a boy who's born XXY. So that's confusing because now there's both XX and XY there. So may appear feminine, have undersized sex organs, and be infertile. Turner syndrome is a girl who is born X who will be infertile and appear boyish as an adolescent. And so here we've got the graphics below there that show both the Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome. Hormonal and gonadal sex. So what is a gonad? Gonads are sex glands that affect sexual development and behavior by secreting hormones. Female gonads are ovaries. Male gonads are testes. Estrogens are female hormones and androgens are male hormones. Testosterone is an androgen and is secreted mainly by the testes. In the absence of testosterone, the developing embryo will develop female reproductive organs and genitals, regardless of the genetic sex. Let me repeat that. In the absence of testosterone, the embryo will develop female reproductive organs and genitals, regardless of genetic sex. So it may very well be that we have an XY embryo developing, but if something went haywire and not enough testosterone or no testosterone was available at the time of important of sexual development, of organ sexual development, then female reproductive organs and genitals will be created. So right there, one can still have an XY chromosomal configuration. However, in the absence of testosterone and instead estradiol, there will be essentially a feminization. Hormonal, continuing, an intersexual person is an ambiguous has ambiguous genital sexuality, genitals that suggest both sexes, androgen insensitivity syndrome, and I'm sorry, we still have all these definitions to go through. Androgen insensitivity syndrome is an inherited disorder. Male embryos fail to develop male genitals because of unresponsiveness to testosterone. Everything's got to work properly, folks. Congenital androgyny hyperplasia is genetic abnormality. Adrenals produce excess androgen, sometimes creating a female child with male genitals. So, sexual differentiation of external genitalia, homologous structures, and the differentiation of male and female external genitalia from different primordial structures in the embryo. So these are all embryonic graphics from going. This is at the indifferent stage, or in other words, at some point we are all both male. At some point there's okay, what is this embryo going to go? Which direction? Male, female. So this is the indifferent stage. In the presence of more testosterone and no estrogen and less estradiol, we get male differentiation. Or if we have an abundance of estradiol and little or no testosterone, then we'll get the female differentiation. This is at the 7th to 8th week, and then moving into the 12th week, we have you can see how the differentiation has almost to completion here at the 12th week. Genital sex is primary sexual characteristics or sexual and reproductive organs. Those are the primary sexual characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics are features other than genitals and reproductive organs, like breasts and facial hair, and they start to appear at puberty onward. Menarche is the onset of menstruation. Ovulation is the release of ova from the ovaries, and menopause is the end of monthly menstrual cycles and usually occurs in the late 40s or early 50s. Many of you, I'm sure, probably already know this, but remember, now this is a Psych 1 class, and so we need to include everything that we know and some things that we thought we know, maybe you don't really know and need to relearn it. But this, I'm sorry for the essential high school health class type introduction and definitions to this, but some people aren't quite aware of many of these things, and some people are embarrassed in talking about anything of a sexual nature. However, again, this is part of normal behavior, just like everything else. So sex is among us. This is how we live. This is why we're here. And there's great distribution in it. Sexual orientation is a degree of stable emotional and erotic attraction to the same sex, opposite sex, or both sexes. So again, degree of stable emotional and erotic attraction to the same sex, opposite sex, or both sexes, sexual orientation. Definition: heterosexual, romantically and erotically attracted to the opposite sex. Definition of homosexual, romantically and erotically attracted to the same sex. Bisexual, romantically and erotically attracted to both sexes. And asexual, not romantically or erotically attracted to either sex. So this term, homosexuality, is the sexual orientation, and it may be partly hereditary, as is almost everything else. If it's not, and if many things aren't hereditary, then at least, for example, we talked a bit about drug use, or that, and when one gets into a dependency, a substance dependency problem, even those have some hereditary basis. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go that way or not. It just simply depends upon not only predilection, but then what is learned thereafter. So sexual orientation may be partly hereditary. There's also something called the prenatal hormonal theory of homosexuality. And that is a theory, really more of a hypothesis, because it really hasn't panned out that well. Theory about hormonal levels during pregnancy. Parenting does not make children homosexual. I want to repeat that. Parenting does not make some children homosexual. So there are some parents or people that may be homophobic, and their child is gay or lesbian, and they think to themselves, where did we go wrong? If in fact they are homophobic, you didn't. Parenting doesn't make children homosexual. And I use the term homophobia, which is a prejudice, fear, and dislike directed at homosexuals. And these two terms often get confused. People talk about homophobia as if you don't like somebody who's gay or lesbian, whereas in fact, that's a fear. Whereas heterosexism is a belief that heterosexuality is better or more natural than homosexuality. Heterosexism, racism, ageism, isms. Gender development. So what is gender? What is gender identity? And again, I started out earlier that that the term gender and the term sex are often used interrelatedly, and they're not. Gender identity is one's subjective sense of being male or female as expressed in appearance, behavior, and attitudes. The biological biasing effect is a hypothesis that sex hormones may sex type the brain before birth, altering the chances of developing feminine or masculine traits. And this is also, I mentioned this a bit earlier. Gender role socialization is the process of learning gender behaviors regarded as appropriate for one's sex in a given culture. So context, culture, society all play major roles in gender and gender role development. As you can see here on the right, what I have here, you've got the girl playing with the truck and the boy playing with dolls. And there is nothing genetically coded that where boys have to play with trucks and GI Joes and cars and guns and missiles, and girls have to play with dolls and play with stoves and other household items to make them a good role model as a future mother and wife, and the boy as a future husband and provider. All from culture. Nothing says, there's no genetics that say, or at least none that I know of. I shouldn't say there isn't any because I don't know everything, but no. So gender roles, they're favored patterns of behavior for males and females. Girls are expected to be sensitive and boys dominant. So what are gender roles? Stereotypes, these are oversimplified beliefs. In fact, any stereotype is an oversimplified belief. And be careful of that because oversimplified beliefs truncate distributions. That's all they do. You're cutting off the tails of any distribution. And that may very well amount for up to 50% of the distribution. So oversimplified beliefs about what men and women are really like, those are gender role stereotypes. And in fact, sometimes comedies simply will play up and go to extremes on gender role stereotypes because it's funny to see that or somebody behaving like that. Gender roles appear to be learned. We learned them. And I've got here just from GQ magazine, men's magazine, Gentleman's Quarterly, on the top, what the gender role stereotypes for females are and for males. Gender role stereotypes. And here we've got the man over here, the man outside, he's washing the car, and the woman is inside making the pots and pans sparkling clean with her apron on. I'm surprised he doesn't even have a tie on, but yeah, he is washing the car. Notice that this is like in the 50s. And if you go back to YouTube and look at some of those old 50s, they've got examples of 50s serial programs on TV back then, like Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. Gee, I'm sure there are quite a few others back there, and the Dick Van Dyke Show, lots of other serials that back there that displayed to the viewing audience how men act, how women act. It's learned, and we learn very quickly through modeling and reinforcement. Male and female behavior. Males are encouraged to engage in instrumental behavior. Instrumental, right? Or in other words, they go out and they do things and control their emotions and prepare for the world of work. So they're goal-directed behaviors. Go out and you have a goal and you go out and you do it. You can do it and better to go out and do it aggressively and aggressively and with good planning and tactics. Females are encouraged to engage in expressive behavior and to a lesser degree, prepare for motherhood. So expressive behaviors are emotion, oriented behaviors. This is how we learn. This is what we learn. It's not necessarily what we are. It's simply what one learns. In fact, like I said earlier, much earlier, we learn everything. Everything. It's not like we're programmed. We learn and continue to learn and build upon the learning. The fact that you can distinguish between figure ground, between an edge, a straight edge and a round edge is simply because you started learning that when you were a couple months old. Androgyny. The example here I'm using is Sandra Bem, the Bem sexual inventory, it's called. So androgyny and Sandra Bem developed the sexual inventory, BSRI, and it consists of 60 personal traits, 20 each for masculine, feminine, and neutral. So based upon that, masculine, feminine, and neutral, the BEM sexual inventory will give one a distribution of how much is in each category. Androgyny is having both masculine and feminine traits in a single person. So androgynous individuals are more adaptable in our society, in fact. And it doesn't necessarily mean a sexual attraction, but simply one who adapts well in our society by having both masculine and feminine traits, that is, both instrumental and expressive. Rigid gender stereotypes can restrict behavior, especially in males. I'm sure we've all met them before. If you look at this graph here, so these are the age groups, 9, 10, 11, 12, moving forward in development. And here's the intimacy mean right here, level of intimacy. Let's just say at which one can engage. Intimacy, emotional intimacy, discussing your feelings. Discussing by feelings, I mean feelings like, are you hurt? Are you angry? Are you happy? How one's autonomic nervous system and appraisal of what's going on is important to everybody. Males in our culture are taught to suppress that. That's frustrating. That produces conflict. And conflict produces not only psychological disorders, but also behaviors that result in aggression. So rigid gender stereotypes restrict behavior, and in so doing, we see here females then as a consequence of gender stereotyping, we get this polarity. And polarity like that, maybe sometimes not so good. Here's the Bemroll sexual inventory right here, and it says rate yourself on each item on a scale from 1, never almost true, to 7, almost or always true. And there's the 60 items right there, and then you rate yourself relative to each one of those phrases or descriptors. Here's the inventory score sheet that you can use. And I encourage you to use it and rate yourself. When sex and gender do not match. Now, and when this occurs, it is society that is pushing, in your culture, which is putting pressure on you and causes the conflict. It's not really the other way around. When sex and gender do not match. Definition of gender variant. It refers to people who, with some degree of mismatch between their biological sex and their preferred gender It's a preference. Biological sex, yes, that's what it is. But your gender could be preferred because large portions of gender are taught. You learned them. Some see gender variance as unusual, but not pathological. Others see it as a form of psychiatric illness, like a gender identity disorder. Sex reassignment surgery is undertaken for more extreme forms of gender variance, such as intersexuality and transsexuality. But on a scale of 1 to 10, in terms of pain, how about in terms of body dysmorphia? Somebody who feels that their physical body and the way it functions. Social dysmorphia, discomfort someone feels by how they are seen socially, and mind dysphoria, discomfort someone feels when their thoughts and their emotions are at odds with their sense of identity. Conflict. And this type of conflict leads to pain, leads to these types of dysphorias. Sexual behavior and arousal. Now let's talk about sex, the act of sex, the behavior of sex, and general erogenous zones and erotic behavior. Erogenous zones are areas of the body that produce pleasure and or provoke erotic desires, generally speaking, genitals, breasts, etc. Sexual scripts are unspoken mental plans that guide our sexual behavior. These things we also learn. Sex drive is the strength of one's motivation. Remember, we just talked about motivation in our last lecture. The strength of one's motivation to engage in sexual behavior. And remember, you can live your entire life with ever not having sex. You have to have food, not have water. You can still go without sex. More definition: castration, surgical removal of the testes or ovaries. If you were a Game of Thrones fan, you will recognize the guy on the left. He was a eunuch, a man who's been castrated. Is called been referred to as a eunuch, and he had been castrated. Sterilization is also can be a form of surgery, but we can also have chemical sterilization as well. Like a vasectomy or a tubal ligation is a form of sterilization, and it makes a man or a woman infertile. The chemicals on the right there, Depo-Provera, is a form of chemical castration for men. Often individuals who are extreme sexual predators, so either extreme pedophiles or rapists will be court mandated to receive Depo-Provera, which essentially is, like I said, is a chemical castration that with many would reduce their sexual arousal and motivation. Sexual response, and many have heard perhaps of Masters and Johnson. I know one of the premium channels even had a series about Masters and Johnson. Masters and Johnson revolutionized sexual research. And in their research, sexual response, they discovered, can be divided into 4 phases that occur in the following order. And remember, they did tremendous amount of research in sexual responsiveness and in the entire act of coitus. So these 4 stages: excitement, initial signs of sexual arousal; plateau, physical arousal intensifies; orgasm, climax and release of sexual excitement, and resolution, return to lower levels of sexual tension and arousal. So in the Masters and Johnson model here, here's their 4 stages: excitement, plateau, orgasm, resolution. And then the 5th phase, it's not really a phase, it's called the refractory period. And it's in men. The refractory period can last from a couple seconds with very young men to days with much older men. So the refractory period basically is the short time period after orgasm when men are unable to reach orgasm again. Ejaculation is the release of sperm and seminal fluid by the male at orgasm. Okay, paraphilias. Maybe you haven't heard of this term before. It's a technical term that is a classification of sexual deviation disorders. It's in DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and have been. So paraphilias include sadism, sexual sadism, sexual masochism, and some of these others, which we'll discuss. But it is a tendency to be compulsive or destructive in preferences in sexual preferences or behaviors, deviations. Now, these deviations aren't necessarily bad as long as they're not bothering anybody else. So, for example, a fetish is a sexual deviation. If it's not bothering anybody else and you have a shoe fetish and you've got 10,000 shoes in your closet and you go in them and have a sexual experience with your shoes, and I'm really not trying to be funny here because things like this do happen. It's not harming it. It might be harming you because you're spending a lot of time doing that and not doing whatever else outside of there you need to do. But let's go through some of these paraphilias. Sexual sadism, and it's sexual. Okay, so in other words, when you say somebody is a sadist, you're really not really a sadist or a sadist unless you're deriving sexual pleasure from inflicting pain. Now, there may be a rush from somebody like these dominatrix, or people who inflict pain with a little whip or something like that, and that may cause some sexual stimulation. But we're talking, if this goes to a point where there's some serious intrusion on the rights of others, we have a problem. Sexual masochism, that's the same thing, only deriving sexual pleasure from receiving pain or humiliation. So if one person in the partnership is a sadist and the other is a masochist, and they're about the same level and have safe words to stop, you may have at least a reasonable sexual experience there. Frauderism. A lot of people haven't heard of what frauderism is. Basically, it's sexually touching or rubbing against a non-consenting person. Usually it's a public place, an elevator, a subway, a bus, someplace crowded, in a nightclub, where somebody will grab a woman and then run, disappear, usually. All right, and I bolded these two terms, voyeurism and exhibitionism. I want to talk about those in a little more detail. And voyeurism, now, it's the practice of gaining sexual pleasure from watching others when they are naked or engaged in sexual activity. There's a little bit of, you think about it, some little bit of voyeurism in all of us because the media even plays upon it. The whole idea of showing us just enough or leading this into where's this going from here. I mean, the people who are writers and people who are marketeers have writing scripts in order to guide the audience into just enough arousal to keep our attention and focus on whatever the goal is, whether to keep us watching a film or a series or to buy a product. Exhibitionism is an exhibitionistic disorder involving exposing one's genitals or sexual organs to a non-consenting person. Okay, so if a woman is a stripper and everyone is in there paying to see her take her clothes off, but the state has laws against having certain portions of your body exposed, and yet still everybody in that room is consenting because they paid to get in there, does that necessarily make her an exhibitionist? Because most people who are arrested for exhibitionism, which are usually males, very few females. I think probably the most heinous form, other than rape itself, but is child molestation, pedophilia, which is a paraphilia. Pedophilia is sex with children or child molestation. Most molesters are males, married, and fathers. Most molestations rarely exceed fondling, but the distribution of the different types of pedophilias and combinations thereof also is immense. But as you can see from the graphic that I've got here, there's a garden variety white guy in his, I guess, 30s or 40s, looks like he's in from the 60s or 70s, with carrying an ice cream cone, suit on, nice guy, and is attracting a little girl. That is the picture of the pedophile. The impact of molestation really depends upon how long the abuse lasts and whether genital sexual acts are involved, and also, and I don't have also, the developmental stage or epoch of the child. Or in other words, pedophilia and molestation will affect, let's say, a child who is 10 differently from a child who is 12. Of course, the personality and context of the child herself is obviously very important as well, but you must take into account development. In any stage of development, it's wrong. Not only wrong, it severely impacts the development of the individual. It severely impacts the development of the individual. What are some of the behavioral signs of a child who's being molested or has been molested? So you see these severe developmental gaps. Like I mentioned, molestation is one of the most absolute worst for developing, for smooth development. You see symptoms of a depression in a child, depression, anxiety, withdrawal. It could be also depression, or in other words, it could go the other way. The child may withdraw or may be very aggressive. You may see self-destructive behavior, overly compliant, too well-mannered, and also displays negative behavior and language, which it's also used at home. So the child also may show, and I don't have this on here, and I've just interviewed children who have been molested. Some of these children may, in fact, depending upon their developmental level and what's going on at home, may even show erotic sexual behavior themselves, which is another important feature. And in fact, that may trump the rest of them. A child, let's say 10, 11 years old, who's displaying overt sexual aggressive behavior and seductive behavior. What are some of the tactics of child molesters? They act alone. They're certainly not out there in groups. They a lot of these assaults, and it is an assault, they take place in the abuser's home, in the person's home. They target children through bribes, gifts, games. Then here's the most heinous part of this, is that the abuser uses force, anger, threats, and bribes to gain continued compliance. There are many examples of this. But basically, don't tell your parents. Here's what's going to happen if you do. Exhibitionism is a recurrent urge or behavior to expose one's genitals to an unsuspecting person. Unsuspecting then also means non-consenting. Now, this act is usually performed by a lonely, insecure male, and they seem to seek excitement through exposing themselves. But there's no sexual contact involved. And in probably half the cases, the individual isn't actually sexually aroused, or in other words, he doesn't have an erection. What are some contemporary attitudes and sexual behaviors? Sexual attitudes become more permissive and sexual behavior more prevalent in our culture. Certainly you can see the change, or look at the changes not only just in the past 50 years, but if you look at changes over the past 100, 150 years, the outward expression of attitudes, sexual behaviors has changed considerably. The double standard we have is still very, very prevalent, very, very prevalent, and it depends also upon the culture or any of the subcultures within any society. But double standards exist, so applying different standards of sexual behavior and judging the appropriateness of male and female sexual behaviors. There's a couple of books to read if you want to read about societies where the double standard doesn't exist. One that I can think of right off the bat is a book called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And in that, you'll see where the double standard doesn't exist. They encounter, though, somebody who is well aware of the double standard from where he comes from, and he goes into a society where the double standard doesn't exist, and creates considerable conflict for him. The double standard is less relevant than it has been in the past, but it does very, very, very much exist. The question below, done in 2013, if women hook up, a man or woman hook up and have sex with lots of people, I respect them less. And so on the left side, the percentage of people who agree, and so that's the percentage of the people who agree. And then along the horizontal axis, we have the different, I guess, groups or types of individuals who agree to those things. So among the egalitarian conservatives, we say, well, if it says if a woman hooks up or has sex with lots of people, I respect them less. Of the male conservatives, 35% agree. Of the female conservatives, 55% agree. So it is interesting, though, that on that side, the female conservatives have a greater or higher level of double standard than the male conservatives. Whereas liberals, the females actually have somewhat less of a double standard than the males. And when we see the traditional double standard, we see that that's even considerably less. And then, of course, with the reverse double standard. Rape. Rape is more common than thought, and it is not usually inflicted by strangers. Uh, 50 years, 60, 70 years ago, the term marital rape would actually have been considered more of an oxymoron. How can you have marital rape? I'm married. I can't rape you. Oh, and that's the way it was considered. Once you're married, that doesn't exist. I can have what the male can have sex anytime he wants. We've grown out of some of these standards, I guess, in most cultures or within our culture and then subcultures. But marital rape is a rape carried out by the spouse, obviously. And then acquaintance or date rape is forced intercourse that occurs in the context of a date or another voluntary encounter. So let's look at the relationship to the perpetuator and the different types of rape here in this pie chart. And we see that 46% of the rapes relative to the relationship to the perpetuator or perpetrator, 46% are someone the woman was in love with. 46%. The next largest is 22%, and that's done by an acquaintance. We see only 4% actually done by a stranger. Somebody hanging out in a dark alley or something waiting or whatever. Yeah, only 4%. It is funny that we fear the lower probabilities. Same with flying. In an airplane, the probability of dying from a flight is as minuscule as winning the lottery right now on a ticket or on any ticket. Minuscule. Yet still we fear that has the lowest probability in cases like that. What are some rape myths? A woman who appears alone in public and dresses attractively is asking for it. It's a myth. She can dress attractively just like anybody else can. Doesn't mean that she wants to be raped. When a woman says no, she really means yes. No, yeah, it's true. No means no. I don't know of any world where we play the opposites. No, no's no. Many women who are raped actually enjoy it. Absolutely not true. They're traumatized. Some of these things actually anger me, these myths, because they're all generated by men who clearly want to justify abusing women. If a woman goes home with a man on a first date, she's interested in sex. Again, not true. These are generalities, myths, generalities that don't apply to specific incidences and circumstances. And last, if a woman is sexually active, she's probably lying if she said she was raped. Oh, that's just pathetic. Pathetic. Now let's talk about forcible rape. This is a sexual intercourse that's carried out against the victim's will, usually under the threat of bodily violence. Rape. Rape is a crime of violence. It's brutal, it's aggressive, and it's based on the need to debase others. Men can be subjected to rape as well. Think going to prison. A lot of people don't report rape. They think the police won't be able to catch them, or want to avoid the embarrassment and the publicity, or fear of reprisal, or they want to keep the family and friends from knowing. A woman who is married and is raped feels very, very embarrassed many times. But if she can't tell her husband or partner that there's a problem. STD, sexually transmitted disease. STDs and safer sex. An STD is a disease passed from one person to another by intimate physical contact. Otherwise, they're called venereal diseases. AIDS, chlamydia, gonorrhea, hepatitis B, that is, herpes, syphilis. Something that is asymptomatic is a disease that lacks obvious symptoms of illness and therefore makes the disease harder to detect. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I certainly suggest that you review them. Chlamydia, trich or trick is a parasitic infection of the genitals, gonorrhea, HPV, syphilis, herpes, hepatitis B, and HIV. More on HIV/AIDS. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. It is a sexually transmitted virus that disables the immune system. So it doesn't make you sick. It attacks our systems that keep us from getting sick. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, is caused by HIV and is often fatal. And 2030, when it was first known and called HIV AIDS in the early 80s, it was absolutely fatal. It was a death sentence. It's caused by HIV. And it attacks the immune system, weakens the immune system, and allows for other diseases and infections to invade the body. The white blood cell count is often very much dangerously lowered. STD risky behaviors include unprotected vaginal, oral, or anal sex without a condom with an infected partner. Having 2 or more sex partners, additional partners also increase the risks. So the more partners you have simultaneously, the more risk you're entertaining. Risk with sex with someone you don't know well, or with someone who you know has several partners. Definitely sex with somebody you know injects drugs, and sharing needles is going to expose you considerably more to HIV. So what are some safer sex practices? Well, not having sex. Then sex with one mutually faithful, uninfected partner who you trust. Not injecting drugs, discussing contraception with your partner, and being very selective regarding your sexual partners. And selection doesn't necessarily mean, oh, you look good, come with me. No, that means having a greater discussion and with responses that seem reasonable and that you believe. Reducing your number of sexual partners, discussing partner sexual health prior to engaging in sex. That goes along with what I was saying at the beginning, being selective. Not engaging in sex while intoxicated or under the influence of any other drug that's going to impede your good judgment. And of course, use a condom. Sexual satisfaction. That's another, and remember we talked about that just in the Masters and Johnson stages of coitus. Not everybody experiences sexual satisfaction, either with a person or through masturbation. The elements necessary for continuing healthy sexual relationship include sexual anticipation, valuing one's sexuality. You deserve to feel good sexually, feeling that you deserve sexual pleasure, and valuing intimacy. Less than half of people are satisfied with their sex life. Just over 4 in 10 people, or 43%, say that they are at least somewhat satisfied with their sex life. And this was from a study of Americans 45 and older. Again, you might want to examine this as well in terms of attitudes towards sexuality as well as sex frequency. This varies. The sex frequency, of course, varies relative not only to your age and your development, but also in your culture, where you grew up, what you learned. Lots of distribution there. Intimacy and communication, which unfortunately lacks in many relationships. How can intimacy and communication be maintained and nourished? Number one, avoid gunny sacking whenever you're having any kind of a argument. I wouldn't even say, let's say a heated discussion. Gunny sacking, we also called it kitchen sinking. Sometimes you'll hear that term, is unleashing a bunch of collected resentments, things that you bring up from 5 years ago that has nothing to do with the current situation. It's called gunny sacking. Don't do that, please. Because all you're doing is trying to make yourself feel better and hurt the other person. Be open about your feelings. It's very difficult to do for some people. Admit when something hurts you. Admit when you feel sad about something. Admit when you feel angry about something. So rather than just expressing a whole bunch of anger and shouting, talk about what you're angry about. Go down into yourself and look, what is this that's pissing me off so much? If it indeed is anger that you're discussing. Don't attack the other person's character. That has nothing to do with the context of the situation. Don't do that. Don't try. It's not a fight. If you have an intimate relationship with this individual, if this person is your spouse, partner, don't try to win. Winning. If there's a winner, there's a loser. Now, how is a winner and a loser going to have a good relationship? It doesn't work. If you're in this thing only to win, you're going to lose. So don't do that. Do recognize that anger is appropriate. It is. Discuss it. Look at your own anger and examine it. Talk about it. Try to see things through your partner's eyes, or in other words, be empathetic. But on the other hand, don't be a mind reader. By inserting your ideas and beliefs into another person's head, or at least assuming that that's what they think and say, that's intrusive and insulting. Don't do that. Here's 10 ways that you can avoid intimacy. In some ways, this is almost sarcastic. But 10 ways to avoid. If you don't want to be intimate at all, do these. Don't talk about anything meaningful, especially about your feelings. Don't ever show your feelings. Always be pleasant and pretend everything's okay, even if you're upset or dissatisfied. And if your partner can't see through that, then your relationship is questionable anyway. Always win. Never compromise. Always win. Everything has to be your way all the time. Always keep busy. That way you can always avoid intimacy and make your partner feel unimportant in your life. You're doing what you're doing and they're not important at all. Always be right, and that's always part of always winning. Don't let on that you're human. Never argue. So you see, you're two different human beings. You have different beliefs. You're not completely the same, and different things may trigger each of you differently. If you never argue, if you never have contentious, not necessarily contentious, but heated discussion over beliefs that cause either one of you some conflict, you're not going to learn how to adapt to one another and or the world in general. Having these kinds of discussions helps you to adapt and become more flexible and to see things in different ways. By having an intimate, closer partner, you're actually in an excellent educational situation, if you can look at that, because you're in a situation where you have somebody who's with you and you can both learn about things together and then discuss them and go out and try things and then learn together. So if you don't argue, you'll never reveal differences and make changes. Remember, I'm talking the opposite. So again, ways to avoid intimacy. Make your partner guess what you want. That way, you can tell your partner that she or he doesn't really understand or love you. The stereotype is used very often with females in TV shows and sitcoms and things like that. You know, where the males say, "Well, I can't read your mind," and she'll say, "But she didn't communicate to him, and he didn't communicate to her." So they use these contentious situations as in comedic roles. Well, in fact, many people look at those and think, "Oh, that's how a relationship is supposed to be." It's fiction. Here's something else. Always take care of your own needs first, and always avoid shared goals. Keep the television set on. Wouldn't you rather be watching TV than talking to your partner? And this may also go with computers, like say computer games or pornography is another one, or surfing the net. Your head's in that screen and not out there with people who are important in your life. Sexual dysfunctions. These are and these are listed also in DSM-5. They've been changed somewhat since DSM-4R. Little different names, but essentially they are the same issues. So there are desire disorders, and whereas a person has little or no sexual motivation or desire. There are arousal disorders. And again, remember, these go along with the stages that we learned with Masters and Johnson. Desire, arousal, so the person desires sexual activity but can't become sexually aroused. Orgasm disorders, where the person doesn't have orgasms or experiences orgasms either too soon or too late. So there can be a much delayed orgasm or premature orgasm. Then there are also sexual pain disorders where the person experiences pain and it makes coitus uncomfortable or impossible. Let's talk about sexual desire disorders first. One is called hyposexual desire. Hypo means under, hypo, like a hypodermic needle goes under your skin. Hyposexual desire, it is a persistent, upsetting loss of sexual desire. And both aspects of these have to be present. We're talking, this is an actual disorder. There's sexual aversion disorder, which is persistent feelings of fear, anxiety, or disgust about engaging in sex. Then there are arousal disorders, and notice I put Masters and Johnson back here again. So under arousal disorders, there's erectile disorder or erectile dysfunction, or basically impotence, and that's the inability to maintain an erection for coitus, lovemaking. That in and of itself, lovemaking, that is a cultural term. So anyway, inability to maintain an erection for lovemaking, once known as impotence. Now, it can have psychogenic causes, and in fact, any kind of anxiety, fear will definitely impede an erection. So psychogenic causes having psychological and not physical causes. Masters and Johnson developed the process called sensate focus. This is their thing, and this is a type of therapy that directs a couple's attention to natural sensations of sexual pleasure and also builds communication skills. So rather than worrying about performance or worried about pain or unpleasant experiences in sex, that worry isn't. It takes your focus away from the actual experience itself, and so sensate focus brings you back to that. Arousal disorders include sexual arousal disorders occurs in a female response with little or no physical arousal to sexual stimulation, and this is also treated with sensate focus. Female orgasmic disorder is inhibited female orgasm or anorgasmia, and it's manifested by recurrent delay or absence of orgasm. There's other kinds of psychological factors that may very well be associated with female orgasmic disorder, and those include fear, guilt, concerning sexual impulses. Like some girls earlier, they're taught sex is bad or immoral or something, or dirty even, dirty. And then that builds up, and then they've got this fear and this guilt and all this other stuff and this anxiety. Yeah, no, they're not going to get aroused or have, and let alone have an orgasm with all that stuff going on. Any hostility toward men will also kill a female's sexual pleasure. Orgasmic disorders in men, of which there are two here: male premature ejaculation, and this is common before 59 years of age. This is a persistent and recurrent onset of orgasm and ejaculation prior to having much sexual stimulation and pleasure. It can also lead to a lot of embarrassment, and this then leads to an anxiety, and then that anxiety then may go back then into, so then the guy may not even be able to get an erection because of the fear of premature ejaculation. Then there's also male orgasmic disorder, where you have a retarded or greatly slowed ejaculation response or inhibited male orgasm. In practice, I've seen this a lot with men who are taking SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or in other words, antidepressant drugs like, Prozac is an old one, or Lexapro, or any of the others, SSRIs. They actually will produce, with many men, male orgasmic disorders. In other words, they'll have a greatly extended period prior to ejaculation, if they can ejaculate at all. And I put that down there also with an asterisk. Sexual pain disorders for females, and I think that in fact I know that these terms were taken out of DSM-5, but they're still applicable. One is called dyspareunia, and this is genital pain associated with sexual intercourse. Then there is vaginismus, and this is involuntary spasm of the musculature of the outer third of the vagina that interferes with vaginal penetration. And it causes a lot of personal distress. So in other words, there'll be such a spasm on the musculature on the outer third of the vagina, basically it blocks penetration. And it's also painful. Non-coital sexual pain disorders is genital pain induced by non-coital sexual stimulation. It could be due to, let's say, to autoerotic stimulation. Non-coital means autoerotic, or in other words, masturbatory. We are at the end of now of our discussion of sex and gender. So I will see you guys next time.